Somewhere beneath the Arctic ice off the coast of Greenland, there's a component of a hydrogen bomb. It's been there since 1968, and despite months of cleanup efforts, millions of dollars spent, and the full resources of the U.S. military, nobody has ever found it. This isn't fiction. This isn't a Tom Clancy novel. This is a documented nuclear accident that most people have never heard about. Today we're uncovering one of the Cold War's most chilling disasters, the Thule Air Base crash. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the term broken arrow still sends shivers down the spines of military officials, and why this particular incident remains one of history's most unsettling nuclear mysteries. What is a broken arrow? First, let's talk about the terminology. In the U.S. military's classified lexicon, they have a code phrase for nuclear weapon accidents, broken arrow. It sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? But there's nothing poetic about what it actually means. A broken arrow is an unexpected event involving nuclear weapons, warheads, or components that does not create a risk of nuclear war. This includes non-nuclear detonation, when the conventional explosives detonate but don't produce a nuclear explosion, radioactive contamination, loss of a weapon in transit, or the emergency jettisoning of nuclear weapons. Now here's the part that should concern you. According to declassified documents, there have been at least 32 documented broken arrow incidents between 1950 and 1980. 32 times that we know of. Bombs dropped accidentally over populated areas, weapons lost at sea, aircraft crashes, storage facility fires. But among all these incidents, one stands out. Not just because of the danger it posed, though that was considerable, not just because of the environmental contamination, though that lasted decades, but because of what was never found, and what might still be waiting beneath the ice. The Thule crash. January 21st, 1968. The Cold War is at its height. The world lives under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, and the U.S. Strategic Air Command has adopted strategies that, in retrospect, seem almost insane. One of these was Operation Chrome Dome, keeping nuclear-armed bombers in the air 24/7, ready to strike the Soviet Union at a moment's notice. But the mission we're talking about today was something different, something even more unsettling. It was called Hardhead. While Chrome Dome bombers flew offensive patrols near Soviet borders, Hardhead had a different purpose: surveillance. You see, Thule Air Base in Greenland hosted a critical early warning radar, part of the ballistic missile early warning system that would detect Soviet ICBMs coming over the North Pole. This radar was America's first line of defense, providing maybe 15 to 25 minutes of warning before nuclear missiles struck. But there was a problem. The communication lines from Thule to NORAD headquarters were vulnerable. If contact was suddenly lost, how would anyone know if it was just a technical glitch, or if the Soviets had just vaporized the base as the opening move of World War III? The Pentagon solution? Keep a nuclear-armed B-52 constantly circling within visual range of Thule. If communications went down, the bomber could look out the window. If the base was intact, report back. If it was a smoking crater, well, that bomber would be confirming the start of Armageddon. So on this particular day, a B-52 Stratofortress, call sign Hobo 28, tail number 58-0188, is flying one of these lonely Sentinel missions. The crew of 7 includes Captain John Haug as aircraft commander, with Captain Leonard Svitenko as co-pilot. Major Frank Hopkins serves as radar navigator, Captain Richard Marks as electronic warfare officer, and Captain Curtis R. Criss as substitute navigator. Major Alfred DeMario is aboard as the mandatory third pilot, and Staff Sergeant Calvin Snap mans the tail gun position. In the bomb bay, 4 Mark 28 thermonuclear weapons, each one approximately 70 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The flight path takes them over Thule Air Base in northwestern Greenland, just 950 miles from the North Pole. This is one of the most remote and desolate places on Earth. At the crash site, temperatures average 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, sometimes plunging as low as 76 below. 6 hours into the flight, something goes wrong. A fire breaks out in the navigator's compartment. The exact cause was never definitively determined, though cushions placed on top of a heating vent were the suspected source. What we do know is this: the fire spread quickly, the cabin filled with smoke, and despite the crew's frantic efforts, the flames could not be contained. The pilot, Captain John Hogg, made the decision to attempt an emergency landing at Thule. At 3:22 p.m. local time, he declared a Mayday emergency. But they weren't going to make it. The fire was too intense. The controls were failing. Hogg made a crucial decision. Rather than risk crashing into the base, where the radar station and personnel were located, he maneuvered the burning bomber away, heading for the unpopulated ice of North Star Bay. Then he gave the order to bail out. The crew began to eject. Captain Curtis Criss, the substitute navigator, went first, ejecting from the lower deck through the darkness into the Arctic night. Major Frank Hopkins, the radar navigator, followed. Then Captain Richard Marks and Staff Sergeant Calvin Snap. Finally, Captain Hogg and Major DeMario, who had been occupying the co-pilot's ejection seat, gave their crewmate below as much time as possible before they too ejected. 6 crew members escaped. 1 did not. Captain Leonard Svitenko had given up his ejection seat to Major DeMario for the long mission. When the bailout order came, Svitenko had no ejection seat, only a manual escape hatch in the floor. In the smoke-filled depressurizing cabin, he attempted to exit through the lower hatch. Somewhere in that desperate moment, whether striking the hatch itself, the aircraft structure, or the electronic countermeasures antennas on the fuselage, he sustained fatal head injuries. His body was later recovered on the ice. His name deserves to be remembered: Captain Leonard Svitenko, the sole fatality of the crash. The survivors were scattered across the frozen landscape. 3 landed within a mile and a half of the base and were rescued within 2 hours. Captain Hogg and Major DeMario landed inside the base perimeter itself, but Captain Curtis Criss, the first to eject, had landed on the far side of a small mountain, 6 miles from the base, completely isolated in total Arctic darkness. With no way to signal for help and no visibility to navigate, he inflated his emergency raft, wrapped himself in his parachute, and waited. For 21 hours, in temperatures of -23 degrees Fahrenheit, Criss waited on that ice floe. When rescue teams finally found him using dog sleds, the local Inuit were astonished he was still alive. He survived, but the extreme frostbite cost him both his legs. The B-52 continued on its trajectory, pilotless, burning. About 7.5 miles from the runway at Thule Air Base, it slammed into the frozen sea ice at approximately 560 miles per hour at 3:39 p.m. The impact was catastrophic. The conventional explosives in all 4 hydrogen bombs detonated, not the nuclear components, thankfully, but the chemical triggers. The explosions scattered burning jet fuel, bomb fragments, and radioactive material across the ice and snow. The crash site covered an area roughly 1 mile by 3 miles. 4 thermonuclear weapons, destroyed on impact, or so everyone thought. The cleanup and the missing component. Within hours, the scale of the disaster became clear. Radioactive plutonium, uranium, tritium, and americium were scattered across the frozen landscape. This wasn't just a military problem, it was an environmental catastrophe. The U.S. military launched Operation Crested Ice, one of the largest nuclear cleanup operations in history. Over 700 Danish and American personnel were deployed to the crash site. For 9 months, they worked in brutal Arctic conditions, temperatures averaging 40 below zero and sometimes reaching 76 below, scraping contaminated ice and snow into barrels. They collected approximately 550,000 gallons of contaminated liquid and snow. Official reports stated that 93% of the contaminated material was removed from the accident site. They recovered fragments of the bombs, crumpled pieces of metal, twisted components, sections of casings. They accounted for the primary stages of all 4 weapons, more or less. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. In 2008, 40 years after the crash, a BBC investigative report revealed something the Pentagon had never publicly acknowledged. A component from the secondary stage of one of the hydrogen bombs was never recovered. This was a cylinder of highly enriched uranium, described in classified documents as resembling a Marshall's baton, the part that creates the massive fusion yield in a hydrogen bomb. Now, to be clear, this isn't an intact nuclear weapon sitting on the ocean floor. It couldn't detonate on its own, but it's a critical component containing weapons-grade uranium, and it's still classified technology. According to declassified documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, American search teams conducted underwater surveys using a mini-submarine called the Star-3. They found evidence that this component had melted through the ice and sunk into the waters below. The problem? The underwater currents beneath Arctic ice are complex and unpredictable, and in 1968, deep-sea recovery technology was far more limited than it is today. They searched, they scanned. The Star-3 conducted multiple dives, but they never found it. The operation was classified confidential no foreign, meaning no foreign nationals, not even the Danes, were to know the real objective. The cover story was a routine survey of the ocean floor. Eventually, the Pentagon made a calculation. The uranium posed minimal environmental risk in the vast ocean. The chance of Soviet recovery was virtually zero given the location. The search was abandoned. So, somewhere in those dark, freezing waters, or perhaps buried in the sediment of the seafloor, sits a component of a hydrogen bomb. The exact radiological state of that component after 57 years is unknown. The environmental impact it may have had is unclear. The possibility of recovery, even with modern technology, remains uncertain. One thing is certain, it's still there. Fallout and secrecy. The immediate physical danger may have been contained, but the political fallout was just beginning. You see, Denmark had an official policy, no nuclear weapons on Danish soil. It was a cornerstone of their Cold War neutrality. Greenland, while granted increasing autonomy, was still under Danish sovereignty, and Thule Air Base, technically, was Danish territory. The Danish government had been told that U.S. aircraft flying over Greenland were not carrying nuclear weapons. That was the agreement. That was the assurance. Except it was a lie. When the crash revealed that B-52s had been routinely flying nuclear-armed missions over Danish territory, monitoring flights, patrol flights, all carrying thermonuclear weapons, the public reaction was fierce. Protests erupted in Copenhagen. There were calls for the removal of the U.S. base at Thule entirely. The Danish government faced a credibility crisis. In fact, the crash did something else. It ended Operation Chrome Dome entirely. The day after the Thule accident, January 22, 1968, the Strategic Air Command terminated the continuous airborne alert program. The risks of keeping nuclear weapons constantly in the air were deemed too great. Then there were the workers. The Danish citizens who had participated in the cleanup operation reported unusual health problems in the years that followed. Higher rates of cancer, unexplained illnesses. The Danish government conducted multiple studies over the decades. Early research in 1987 by the Danish Institute for Clinical Epidemiology found cancer rates among cleanup workers were 40 to 50% higher than comparable populations. But later studies in 1992 and 1995 contradicted these findings. Some researchers attributed elevated mortality to what they called the unhealthy worker effect, the selection of personnel who may have already had pre-existing health risks, rather than radiation exposure itself. The Danish government ultimately rejected claims linking the accident to long-term health issues, though compensation cases dragged through courts for decades. The scientific question remained disputed, with 410 documented cancer deaths among 1,500 workers, but no consensus on whether these rates exceeded what would normally be expected. What is clear, environmental monitoring of the crash site continued for decades. Elevated levels of plutonium were detected in sediment samples through the 1990s and into the 2000s. Scientific expeditions consistently found plutonium concentrations far higher than normal Arctic fallout levels. The most recent comprehensive study in 2011 concluded that radiation doses were lower than the recommended reference level, but monitoring continues even today. Whether the missing uranium component contributed to this contamination or whether it was all from the recovered material remains unknown. And through it all, one question echoed in the frozen silence of the Arctic. What else don't we know? One hydrogen bomb component, lost beneath the ice, never recovered, still out there. It's a sobering reminder that during the Cold War, the world came closer to nuclear disaster than most people realize. Not through deliberate attacks, but through accidents, miscommunications, and the sheer insanity of some of the strategies we employed. And here's the thing. Thule wasn't even the strangest Cold War operation, not by a long shot. If you think flying nuclear bombers 24/7 over the Arctic to visually monitor a radar station sounds crazy, wait until you hear about the CIA's plan to surgically implant listening devices into cats and deploy them as mobile surveillance units against the Soviet Union. I'm not making this up. Click the video on screen to learn about Operation Acoustic Kitty, a covert operation so bizarre, so expensive, and so catastrophically unsuccessful that it would be funny. If it hadn't cost millions of taxpayer dollars and the lives of several cats. The Cold War was stranger than fiction, and we're just getting started. Thanks for watching.